Final Bridge. 今日のことは今日やる。そうしたら先延ばしが癖にならないよ。この完璧じゃない世界を変えてみせるから。艦長、準備できたよ。人類
やっと会議室から出られました。
重曹ウサギ 19C、 今は休んでる場合じゃない。ブローニャの意識、
この
ブローニャは
私の力が
あなたの運命は
崩壊降臨。私のしもべかせいやふっせい
震えなさい制裁のイカズチ忍者の先生ルテ
人類を守るくらい私一人で十分よ。崩壊降臨。私のしもかやふっせい
震えなさい
やせい勝利は愉快なものに。崩壊降臨。私のしもべとふっはっや
震えな制裁のイカズチ断罪の内容まずは下す
やはっはっはっやはっやバカじゃないの。崩壊降臨。私のしもべとなったあんたバカ間に合うまずいこのいただき このくせに生意気ね。人類を守るくらい私一人で十分よ。崩壊降臨。私の指揮や
震えなさい。断罪の内容
雑魚のくせに生意気ね。夜の権限。目障りよ。雑魚のくせに生意気ね。いただき。バカじゃないの。
みんなの気持ちが 怖がらないで、私がいるから。
勇者の力は常に新たな驚きをもたらしてくれます。武装再構築、手動装備開始。
来て、天下準備。やっはっ、よし。外れ。擦り傷だね。くらいや。はっはっ。くらいと。
リチャード。伝承ブローニャは自分の力を広げ続けます。
最後の最後まで戦い続けるわよ。
This was a bad idea. Please, someone help me.
Thanks for your help. Is there any way I can make it up to you?
Whatever your views are on the current state of DBD's balance, there is no denying that most things about the game are in a fairer place than they used to be. Of course, the game isn't perfect, but there's a lot less room for people to exploit certain mechanics for the sole purpose of bullying their opponent and ruining their day. Funnily enough though, if you were to ask an old school DBD player how they feel about the old days of the game, you'll get one of two drastically different answers. Either, this game used to be absolutely miserable, it's a miracle this game even grew a player base, or DBD used to be so fun, it's a shame they nerfed all the fun stuff. What's the reason for this? Find out after this message from today's sponsor, Opera GX. We all know that DBD is well, depending on what role that person played, either of those previously mentioned statements could be true to an extent. One role got to experience a power trip unlike any other offered in a multiplayer game, but the other role was on the receiving end of that. So let me tell you about the downfall of bully squads, what enabled them, what they were capable of, and the changes that eventually led to the extinction of a once feared playstyle. To start things off, let's talk about how bully squads actually operated. They were most often teams of 3 to 4 friends who would play together while on voice comms with the sole intention of trolling, harassing, and overall just ruining their opponent's day. However, this would not be done by outplaying the killer or playing well to cause the frustration of defeat. In fact, quite the opposite. These squads would often straight up ignore their objectives, refuse to repair gens, and not even attempt to escape in favour of keeping the killer stuck in the match for as long as possible whilst absolutely tormenting them. For instance, intentionally triggering glitches that would permanently stop the killer from being able to move, glitching out of bounds into spots where the killer could never possibly reach them, using infinite loops, and some of the many broken items, add-ons, and perks survivors had over the years. Let's start off with the core tactics of movement-based shenanigans. Even in those early days of the game, the community figured out looping pretty quickly. While your standard pallet looping and window looping was already commonplace, it was quite different to the way loops play out nowadays. This was due to a combination of a significantly slower pallet break speed and window vault speed for killers, alongside maps and the pallet spawning system being significantly different to how they are now. Mainly, maps were larger overall, there were significantly more pallets and windows, safer pallets in general, and survivors could straight up blink like the nurse with a mechanic called pallet vacuum. Nowadays, if you're sprinting towards a pallet, you can press the drop button before you're at the pallet and the game will queue up up the input to drop it as soon as you're in range. With Pallet Vacuum, however, if you were to press the drop button from out of range, instead of queuing it, it would instantly teleport the survivor to the far side of the pallet and drop it at the same time. Now, survivors being able to literally teleport does sound absolutely crazy, and that's because it absolutely was. Just like how crazy it is that nearly 85% of people watch videos just like this on my channel. Matches were already frustrating for killers even when people were playing fairly. But bully squads had one issue with this. Even with lots of pallets and the ability to literally teleport when dropping pallets, pallets are finite, so that means it would be possible for killers to actually win the game, eventually, if they dropped all the pallets. And we can't have that now, can we? Luckily for them, there were bugs in the game that solved that problem, introducing infinite loops. Loops that were, as the name implies, infinite, meaning that no matter how long the match goes on for, if a survivor runs that loop, they would never die. How infinite loops would work was typically by having a really good window on a long loop with line of sight blockers. Bloodlust originally wasn't even a thing in the game, but it was added later in an attempt to get rid of infinite loops. However, due to the loops being long and having line of sight blockers, the survivor could continue running the loop while not being in the killer's line of sight, and that would in turn register as them no longer being in chase, thus preventing bloodlust gain. The strong window would offset any distance the killer gained on the survivor, and due to the loop being long, the window wouldn't get blocked as too much time had occurred since the previous vault. Again, due to the loops being very long, it was pretty much impossible for killers to mind game or counter-rotate any of them. While the explanation may make infinite loops sound super complicated, functionally it was as simple as running any other standard window loop. Some of you may be thinking of an obvious solution. If a survivor were to run an infinite loop, drop chase with them and go for someone else. And in the case of a lone survivor using infinite loops in a normal public match, that would work just fine. But in the case of bully squads, all 4 of them would be aware of the infinite loop and would happily use it, so switching targets would achieve nothing. While infinite loops were effectively God mode, that still wasn't enough for some people. While the killer would never be able to win the match against a full team using infinite loops, the killer could still play, which, of course, was absolutely unacceptable. So, depending on the map, bully squads would resort to abusing a bug that allowed survivors to outright disable the killer's ability to move and would have the killer trapped in one spot indefinitely. The bug was patched after years, but how it worked was by having a survivor stood underneath a hole, not an open drop like a hill, specifically a hole, and then getting a killer to drop down said hole. This would typically be done by having one person waiting there already, then having somebody else in chase bring the killer to said hole. The person in chase would drop down the hole and wouldn't get stuck. Then the killer would drop down in pursuit and would instead find themselves stuck on top of the first survivor's head, completely unable to move. Back in the day, I personally had a bully squad use this glitch on me in the original Crota's Prenna Scythen map, which, at the time, was home to the easiest infinite loop in DBD in the main building. They held me hostage for 15 minutes, and repaired an astounding 2 generators in that time, most likely because they expected the killer to leave the match instead of sticking around. After 15 minutes, I assume they got bored because they let me go, but other people at the time wouldn't be let go quite as quickly, with some people being held hostage for 30 minutes or even hours if they didn't quit. To round off the movement-based stuff, there were dead hard bounce glitches. Very similar to the COD 4 bounce glitches from back in the day, dead hard bounces were achieved with the old dead hard's dash, as it applied a tremendous amount of acceleration. So by dead harding off of an edge and hitting another edge at the right angle, it would then in turn bounce the survivor upwards and allow them to land on other objects. Depending on the map, location, and what object the survivor landed on, it could render the survivor totally unkillable, as they'd simply be too high up for killers to reach. This of course meant that it was another tool bully squads could use to become completely unkillable or even hold the game hostage. In the interest of fairness, I think it is important to note that the dead hard bounce glitches were nowhere near as common as a lot of the other stuff on this list, as the glitches weren't in many maps and not as many people knew about them. While everything I just mentioned were powerful tools in the arsenal of a bully squad, capable of making any match completely unwinnable, those weren't the things that built bully squads such an infamous reputation. Instead of abusing infinite loops and bugs, it was instead the mechanics that were intentionally added into the game by behavior that stung the worst. Let's start off with the most famous, or I guess infamous, Instablinds. The Instablind flashlights did exactly what you'd expect. They'd blind the killer instantly. While nowadays you're pretty much only ever blinding the killer if they're stuck in an animation, like breaking a pallet or picking up a survivor, with Instablinds it was fast enough that a survivor could flick it at the killer mid-chase and immediately get results. Since Instablinds made it so you wouldn't need to turn the flashlight on for as long, they also acted as battery add-ons since it would use like half as much juice for each blind, which also meant they wouldn't run out quickly and it would be a nuisance the killer would have to deal with all match long. It wasn't just an annoyance thing either. It severely shifted the balance of the match even further in the survivor's favour, as it completely removed all timing needed for flashlight saves, and positioning too for that matter. As soon as the killer finished picking up the survivor, one click of the beamer and boom, the victim is saved. Even back in those days, good killer players knew to face a wall whenever picking up a survivor to counter flashlight saves. But with bully squads, that was simply not an option, as when a survivor knew they were about to go down, they would run out into the open to ensure there were no walls nearby for the killer to protect themselves with. The rescue was almost guaranteed. Bully squads would run multiple Instablinds and would spam the living daylights out of the killer almost non-stop all match long, and there really wasn't much the killer could do about it. Franklin's demise didn't exist back then, and Lightborn wasn't like how it is nowadays. It didn't make the killer unblindable and instead just made it take 60% longer to blind them, with the added downside of making the killer's vision permanently darker, and that was really not viable for a reason I'll get into later. There's a lot to say about Instablind flashlights, but I won't go into too much detail as I already made an entire video dedicated to them, where a team of survivors bullied the game director for DBD so hard that Instablinds got completely removed within a month. The match was absolute torment. I'll link that video in the description. Next up, the old version of the brand new part. Even nowadays, brand new parts are ridiculously powerful. Being able to repair 15% of a gen in a ridiculously short time and stacking with the base toolbox itself is a huge boost to your objective pressure. But back in the old days of DBD, it was a little bit better. First of all, it didn't require any skill checks to use. You just right-clicked a gen and the